Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to be speaking from a script today. I struggled to keep the time. We'd be here all day if I didn't. So apologies if it seems a little less conversational than others have done. So this is Sensory Approach to Religious Small Finds from Domestic Spaces at Vindolanda. Traditional approaches to Hadrian's Wall have viewed the frontier zone through a primarily military lens, with the installations, tactics, and organisation of the Roman army given primacy. Our view has progressively diversified, however, and a great deal of attention has been paid to asking and seeking answers to social questions. These have ranged from examining the army as a community to considering the lives of non-combatant populations and entirely rethinking the social positions and experiences of women in the forts and extramural settlements. Religion has come under some scrutiny, and advances have been made in understanding temple spaces, the distribution of some deities, and the dynamics of frontier epigraphy. It is notable, however, that despite evidence for its existence, religious practices from domestic spaces along the frontier have remained relatively underexplored. Perhaps the most problematic barrier to this sort of analysis is that reconstructing what types of practices took place within people's homes is difficult. For example, we lack the sort of analytical framework that is applicable to religious evidence from temple contexts, and the texts and iconography from altars provide clues as to how these objects ought to be interpreted. We see the evidence for religious practices in the archaeological record of domestic spaces, but are unable to access what exactly went on. This paper does not aim to reconstruct ritual practices, as we lack sufficient evidence to do this, and attempts to do so are likely to be speculative. Instead, this paper will decentralize ritual practices themselves and focus on human-object interactions. Drawing on previous sensory approaches to small finds by scholars such as Eckhart and Adam Parker, as well as the broader turn towards sensory Roman archaeology propounded by Eleanor Betts, Abigail Graham, and Blanca Missig, to name a few, this analysis seeks to understand how religious objects from domestic spaces were experienced. This approach, as will be shown, has the capacity to create insights into ritual practices that might otherwise prove difficult to understand. Underpinning the importance of the senses in ritual practice is the creation of proximal religious knowledge. Douglas Bailey and latterly Abigail Graham have considered the twin concepts of distal and proximal knowledge, and whilst distal knowledge concerns ideas that are formed, reflexive, and fixed, perhaps comprising widely understood concepts around how ritual was supposed to function, proximal religious knowledge is characterized as religious knowledge produced in the moment. It is highly context-specific, arising from direct embodied and sensory engagements with the physical world, rendering it continually in flux. Graham suggests that objects help create proximal religious knowledge by being equal participants in ritual. And neither human beings nor objects have inherent religious agency, with this being created as objects and humans come together in ritualized settings. Essentially, ritual objects become tools for enacting change, and this change, as suggested by Missig, might be turning negative emotions into positive ones and creating a sense of mastery over circumstance or outcome. This change and its perceived effects, being brought about through the meeting of body and object, becomes embodied as lived religion, or proximal religious knowledge. The ritual objects from domestic finds assemblages from Vindolanda number approximately 250, and broadly fall into 7 categories: figurines, both pipe clay and metal, bells, lamps, key handles, seal box lids, and paterae. Many assemblages also contain fragments of face pots, but these are not going to be considered here, as my own work has raised questions as to whether or not these really were ritual objects. The pipe clay figurines all depict the goddesses Venus and Dionytrix, but the metal examples variably depict other deities, such as Mercury and Jupiter. Additionally, and I think this has been touched on already, zoomorphic tropes, generally big cats, mythical creatures, and birds, are variably present on figurines, lamps, and seal box lids. These objects are obviously diverse and myriad, and discussing all of the evidence is not possible in this short paper today. Therefore, I will concentrate on the pipe clay figurines, bells, and lamps, as not only are these the most numerous, but they are most suited to sensory analysis. These objects also frame the 3 senses which are easily discerned in relation to ritual practice. The first case study of pipe clay figurines considers the role of touch. The second, bells, explores sound. And the final case study, lamps, considers the role of sight. Of course, the senses of smell and taste are likely to be important, but evidence for the sorts of organic compounds that might activate these senses are rarely preserved. In terms of the distribution of these objects across Vindolanda, twice as many pipe clay figurines have been recovered from the extramural settlement as within the fort itself. And whilst the mechanisms behind this are beyond the scope of this paper, this distribution mirrors those from other military sites across Britain. The bells and lamps, however, have been recovered in fairly even numbers from the intramural and extramural settlements. So that brings us on to pipe figs. So the corpus of literature that's been dedicated to the study of pipe-clay figurines is pretty slight, with the exception of Matthew Fittock's wide-ranging assessment, but he primarily concentrates on London and the South. His work has shown, however, that these objects appear to be used in a variety of contexts and by a variety of different social groups, but they're most commonly found in domestic spreads. Venus and Deinutrix figurines appear to have been traditionally linked to the concepts of fertility and the protection of infants. Whilst as a discipline we are generally moving away from matching dietary attributes directly to ritual concerns, the inclusion of Venus and Deinutrix figurines in child burials does suggest that they were linked in some way with concepts of childhood protection and infant death. Blanca Missicans considered the worship of the Nutrices Augusti, which is a sort of similar cult from the Spongia Hygiena temple in Portivo, and has linked the female and infant subjects and imagery associated with the cult to the dangers of the perinatal period in pre-modern societies. She suggests that despite worship of this cult likely reflecting deep-held concerns around child welfare, ritual acts might have created positive emotional transformations, giving worshippers a feeling of agency during a difficult and dangerous period in their child's life. This may have encouraged worshippers to repeat the ritual and thus reinforce ritual behavior, with objects acting as powerful foci for the creation and reformation of memory, religious knowledge, and emotion. Pipe-clay figurines in domestic spreads might have acted similarly. Examining these objects more closely, there are several material affordances that may have aided this. Discussing their materiality first, there have been other phenomenological studies of pottery votives which provide a useful point of comparison. Chiefly Emma Jane Graham has examined terracotta infant statuettes from Republican central Italy. She comments that the hard and unyielding nature of these terracotta objects, with their rough, dry surfaces, feel entirely unlike the soft, yielding and dynamic swaddled infants that they represent. In this case, the material is entirely at odds with the human form of the object, but the size and shape of the object forces the user to treat it like a real infant. My own experience of handling pipe clay has shown something different. Whilst pipe clay is hard, it is also very smooth, with rather a skin-like texture. It also takes body heat, and thus gradually warms to the touch. As these objects are handled, they take on the heat and some of the feel of real flesh, even if they remain unyielding. This particular affordance of pottery is also commented on by Graham in her exploration of the objects used ritualistically by Vestal virgins, and she characterizes this heat exchange as creating awareness of body-object interactions. The direct effect of the body on the object may have helped produce individualized, in-the-moment religious knowledge, thus reinforcing the object as a ritual focus. Furthermore, both the Venus and Deinutrix figurines are constructed with hemispherical bases that allow the object to stand. It is unclear whether these bases were intended solely for display, or whether they could also be used to hold the object upright. If so, this would suggest that the bodies of these figurines were not intended to be touched. Holding the statue by the base would have engendered very specific forms of movement and bodily stress, which may have acted as mnemonics for the emotions associated with the relevant rituals. This chimes with David Chichester's suggestion that kinesthetic movement could act as instruments of knowledge for creating, reforming, and reinforcing ritual habitus. There was probably no single way that these statues were used, and people might have variably held them by their bases or interacted with their bodies, with both methods of use engendering different experiences and tapping into different cognitive constructs. The physical forms of these statuettes differed, with Deinutrix represented as fully clothed in drapery, and Venus as a partially and often almost completely nude figure. If we take pipe clay as mimicking the texture of skin, then interacting with these objects might have been a profoundly intimate experience, especially in the case of the Venus figurines. Whilst, as Fittock has shown, there is far more to Venus than the classical attributes of love and sex, these associations are hard to ignore outright. Quite how these undertones would have been conceptualized is unclear, but touching the nude body of Venus may have engendered different emotional responses to touching the clothed Deinutrix figurines. That is certainly not to suggest that Venus figurines were erotic objects, but rituals that involved interacting with image statuettes of her might have had some of these connotations. The fragility of pipe clay may have also offered the opportunity for further types of interaction. If the object was repeatedly used, breakage was likely. Fittock's assessment has shown that head fragments are generally missing from the archaeological record, which suggests that they were treated differently to fragments of the body and base. There are only 2 heads from the corpus of the Vindolanda pipe clay figurines, which is an exceptionally slim proportion of the overall assemblage. One exists only as a fragment, but another has clearly been ritually altered. A hole has been drilled through the left eye, and it shows evidence of burning. The acts of piercing and burning are fairly common modifications to votive offerings, as seen across a variety of Romani-British temple sites, and it seems that the head in question, after being detached from the body, retained its ritual importance. We can see that these figurines prompted direct physical engagement with a sense of touch, with significant flexibility in exactly how this was enacted. Through interacting with statuettes, different cognitive constructs and or memories of past ritual action might have been brought to mind, and through continued use, new and evolving proximal religious knowledge might have been created. And that brings us on to the bells. It might seem somewhat obvious, but bells make noise. Given that most of the bells, such as the one pictured on screen, are relatively small, they're likely to have made a high ringing chime rather than a sonorous boom. There are many different reasons why this noise might have been desirable, and bells might have had multiple uses in domestic spaces. Thus, whilst figurines can easily be ascribed a ritual function, the plethora of bells from domestic spaces are perhaps less easily defined. Adam Parker has suggested that assigning bells a purely ritual or functional purpose is difficult, but his analysis of tintinnabula has shown that these noise-making objects were likely apotropaic. Of course, tintinnabula different from bells, and the phallic decoration present on some examples does a lot of heavy lifting in ascribing them a ritual function. Despite most of the bells in this assemblage being undecorated, I would argue that we might tentatively suggest that they too were ritually inflected. Heller Eckhart and Sandy Williams posit in their assessment of bells that there is ample evidence that these objects were functional. They may have been strung around the necks of animals, acted as doorbells, or played a role in other contexts in which signalling was important. However, the inclusion of bells in graves and special depositions suggests that they also held a ritual or apotropaic significance. A few bells have also been recovered from temple contexts, and several of these examples have religious inscriptions, which further indicates that bells may have had a ritual purpose. Furthermore, several examples have been found buried in doorways with melon beads packed within the bodies. Considering the general apotropaic significance attached to melon beads, their association with bells underlines that these objects may have been ritually important, and the placement of them within doorways may indicate a sensory ritual function. Parker, in his exploration of tintinnabula, has suggested that they may have been attached to a door or curtain, and thus were activated by movement. The resulting sound would have alerted people inside the space that someone had just entered. People might have desired this signal for numerous reasons, such as alerting someone in a workshop to the presence of a potential customer, but, Parker argues, there may have been a protective element too. The noise may have been part doorbell, part quasi-intruder alarm, letting people know that someone had just entered their space. The phallic decoration found on several examples underlines the ability for noise-making devices to have protective properties. In this instance, there is a link between the sensory affordances of bells and their ritual function. Whilst we do not necessarily know what sorts of ritual practices bells were used in, it does not seem unlikely that their ability to make noise, engage with the senses, and thus perhaps create proximal religious knowledge might have been important. This fits with the broader theoretical concepts in sensory archaeology, which positions direct sensory feedback and proximal knowledge as important for both structuring ritual practice and forming ritual habitus for participants. And finally, we have the lamps. Considering the lamps, relatively little scholarship exists which has directly dealt with their sensory affordances. Examining the roles of light in temple contexts, however, Vicky Jewell has considered how light and shadow might have been used to create vivid sensory experiences in Mithraea. Natural light appears to have been manipulated in Mithraic caves in Tegusor and Santa Maria Capua Vetere, and these natural rock caverns were altered to allow a single beam to penetrate the darkness. Vicky Jewell also suggests that these beams may have acted as gnomon to illustrate specific religious features within the space, mark the changing seasons, or act as a ritual foci in their own right. Furthermore, evidence for lamp lighting in other Mithraic contexts may have been designed to visually mirror the beams of light carved into many Torquatney panels. There is also evidence that some cult statues included cutouts for the eyes and other features that may have been backlit to give the impression that parts of the statue were glowing. In other contexts, Heller Eckhart has considered the role of lamps in creating lighting in Roman barrow burials, where, alongside objects related to feasting and hygiene, they created a domus aeterna and communicated status in death. Obviously, there is likely to be a difference between how rituals were enacted in temple spaces and domestic ones. However, it does seem that there was an association between the manipulation of light and ritual practice. It is not a huge interpretive leap to imagine that light might have also been utilized to create sensory experiences in domestic contexts, and thus formed part of ritual practice. The manipulation of lamps to create patches of light and shadow might have been used to illuminate ritual foci, or generally enhance the atmosphere of ritual practice. This interplay of dark and light may have also helped create proximal religious knowledge through constraining or aiding the sense of sight, with these changes perhaps creating a framework for the enactment of ritual, or helping participants access specific states of mind or memories related to the ritual being undertaken. Whilst it has not been possible to delve into all the different types of ritual objects present in domestic finds assemblage from Vindolanda, the compact set considered here shows that sensory experience may have been important during domestic ritual practices. As shown, the potential range of experiences produced by these objects is wide. and varies from the subtle warming of skin-like pipe clay in the hand to the more obvious visual and auditory feedback from bells and lamps. The shared theme of these objects is that they play on different senses, and in doing so create proximal and embodied religious knowledge. These sensory interactions might have also conjured and perhaps reformed memories of prior ritual experiences, created powerful emotional transformations, and engendered a sense of mastery over circumstance. Thus, through considering liberal religion, we've been able to decentralize ritual practice itself and create different and useful insights into how religion took place within domestic spaces. Thank you.